following is an excerpt from our course OST 100, OpenStack Intro.
Right, when we actually look at the various aspects of OpenStack, this is the last slide, then we'll have a question and answer if anybody has any questions, and then we'll have a bit of a break as well. So what we've actually got, we will come back to it later, but we can see the emphasis that we actually have at the top here on our dashboard with this horizon. Within that we have the various services, of course. So we have our compute services here, right in the heart, where we're actually getting our CPU and memory. And so that, as far as our services are concerned, are Nova. As you will see within, if we track around, then all of these various services all have various collaborations, come access to all the other services. So it's a matter of putting all the services together, but we have our compute services down here. And of course we have things like our identity services. What you've got with your identity services is a service called Keystone. And as you can see here, authorization, authentication. So effectively you wouldn't be able to access the endpoint of another service, a term that's used quite a lot in OpenStack, if you weren't authorized. So, and at each point, when we actually want to put a VM together, you will actually find that for each service that you actually need to contact to put these components together, then the authentication is required. And each of the service will check with Keystone to make sure that you have that authentication and a token can be provided. So this is where, again, we can set people into network administrators, storage administrators, server administrators. So if they try to do anything outside of the boundaries of that, then Keystone is not going to let them. So it's the, for want of a better description, that's your authentication point in the Unix world. That's your groups and your file permissions, come your password entities, but obviously with a certain amount of greater emphasis on that. So our compute services in the middle. Obviously we'll need our network services within that. If we want to actually put it together and orchestrate it as opposed to do it individually and set up multiples and do things time and time again, repetitive, then we can use Heat, our Heat orchestration templates, or HOTS within all of that. We have our various image store, of course, because at the end of the day, if we actually put our CPU and memory together, then of course we need an OS on there. It's not going far without that. We need additional disk space. Then we have our block storage, which of course is Cinder. And our good old object store, again, for our archives and our putting files in places and putting data in places that we don't need to frequently access. The only one I've not actually mentioned there is the good old telemeter service, which is Cellmeter, of course, which is actually looking at what we've actually used, what resources are available, what is in place. So all of it, as you can see, all hangs together. All of these services have direct lines to the appropriate services they need, particularly when you're looking through the middle, network resource and OS, and after that, outside of that, additional disk space, orchestrating it, resources in use, and so forth. All again can be done from your dashboard, which is Horizon, but of course we need to make sure we have the right authentications and authorizations in order to do so. So nice little browser front end called Horizon, you can do all of that stuff with. Right, before we get to the actual core projects and doing a little bit more on each of those names that we've actually mentioned before, then I will just back off for a couple of minutes and sort of ask if there are any questions out there at all. There is a question and answer area that you can actually use if you wish to do it that way, or you can if your audio is in place, you can actually put a question forward that way. Or you can even put it on the chat. Okay, right, okay. If everybody's okay, then.
Excuse me, Graham, there is one question in the Q&A window.
Let me just. Let me just find that. Oops. Let me just have a quick look. Right. Pom, pom, pom.
So the question is why we need block storage at all.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry, I was just trying to find my my question and answer little page has disappeared behind a screen somewhere. So I do apologize for the delay. Why do we need block storage? The block storage aspect is the additional disk space. The additional disk space. So that's what it's actually for. So if you think about a standard server, then if we stand up a standard server, then effectively we'll have a root disk, the ephemeral disk, which is where the root file system and all the operating system actually goes. But of course, depends on the size of the disk that you actually create, and with the various practices that we actually need, you may actually then put a database onto the system, which of course, as far as that is concerned, may need several terabytes of space, a different disk for log files, a different disk for the table spaces and so forth. So it's just the block storage is actually adding additional disk space. So if I actually, just for example, wanted to install a database, that database had a requirement for something like 4 terabytes worth of space, a separate disk of a couple of terabytes for the log files and the transaction logs that were actually required, then I'd set up my VM and it would actually add 2 additional disks to it. So if you think about it in a normal server, again, if we're running out of disk space, we can actually add additional disks and actually place those applications on those disks. So quite common practice is that the standard disk, as we stand up the server, is just to have the root disk with nothing really on it except for the operating system, and then have additional disks where your applications actually sit. The thing with OpenStack is as well, when we add an additional volume, is if that VM, for example, falls over, has a problem, somebody deletes that VM, let's say somebody deleted the VM by accident, then the ephemeral disk would actually be trashed, it's gone. That's your root disk with the operating system on. But because we've provided the 2 additional disks from the block storage, where our application was and where our log files were, that data is safe unless we decide to remove that disk and delete that disk. So even though the VM is lost, we could actually add those 2 disks to another VM that we stood up very quickly, and there's your database and there's your logs as they were the last time they were used by the previous VM. So it's a matter of resource expansion of block devices. So just think of it as it is, of just adding additional disks. Lovely. So hopefully that answers the question.